All right, well, I show it to 10:15, time for class to begin, so I have to interrupt everybody's conversations and be real non-loving about it, force everybody back to their seats. So, we're continuing on in our study of Daniel. We're up to chapter 9 today. I was trying to time this out. I've got to be gone one Sunday at the end of the month, and I thought, well, if I could time it out just right, I'll be gone for Daniel 11, and I can do paybacks to Jerry Myers for all those times he would happen to go out of town on the hard chapter and say, hey, Matt, would you like to fill in for me? I'd say, sure, and then he'd tell me what it was, and I thought, oh, that's why you left town. So, but it may be more toward Daniel 12. I think I'll still be around here, so off the hook on that one. All right, so we're up to Daniel chapter 9 today as we continue working our way through this, really kind of focusing in on how God's plan is highlighted through this. So that'd be good to kind of show you, because each chapter fits into a different period of time, they're not in chronological order. And so Daniel chapter 1 was early during the Nebuchadnezzar reign. It might have been very, very early on as the beginning of the captivity was taking place there in Daniel chapter 1. Then during Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Daniel's chapter 2 and 3, during those visions that were given to him, even into Daniel chapter 4, still dealing with Nebuchadnezzar. After Nebuchadnezzar comes Belshazzar. This, Daniel chapter 5, was kind of the description of the last day of his reign as Darius the Mede comes on. And then in Daniel 6, we're into the early years, but not the first year. This is the lion's den story. So Daniel chapter 6 was during Darius the Mede's reign. If you go into chapter 7, we actually skip back to the first year of Belshazzar's reign. And that's when that one took place. And then last week, we looked at the third year of Belshazzar's reign. And so we're kind of working our way back up into Daniel chapter 9. We're back up to the first year of Darius's reign. So really, chapter 6 is the only one that, well, that's not true. Both 5 and 6 are kind of out of place in the chronological order. They kind of skip ahead to tell those stories, and then we go back into more of these visions. There's an organization to the book. It's just not chronological. And so just so that we're kind of on track of exactly where we are, we're up to the first year of Darius the Mede's reign. This is likely happening, this vision that we're going to see here, and this prayer and vision both. It's more of a prayer and an answer in the form of a vision on this. But in Daniel chapter 9, I would suspect that because this is so early into Darius's reign and we're not given the timeline on the other, this is likely happening before the lion's den, I think, if we were to place it in chronological order. So in the first year of Darius, son of Xerxes, a Mede by descent, who was made ruler over the Babylonian kingdom. And so this kind of gives us this indication, if he's a son of Xerxes, it tells us kind of who he is a little bit more. We don't have Darius the Mede and Cyrus. They're kind of hard to put into placement right there as far as exactly how the two fit in together, other than the fact that we have a split kingdom. And people were put into charge as kings and leaders over portions of the area. This says he was over the Babylonian kingdom. Well, the Babylonian kingdom was only part of the Medo-Persian Empire. So again, that might have been where we see that little bit more difficult, position that we find ourselves trying to find that exact who this was. In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood from the scriptures, according to the word of the Lord given to Jeremiah the prophet, that the desolation of Jerusalem would last 70 years. So I turned to the Lord God and pleaded with him in prayer and petition and fasting and in sackcloth and ashes. And what he's referring to is what he would have read out of, maybe not in this exact chapter verse layout that we have now, but it would come out of what we know as Jeremiah chapter 25. Therefore, the Lord Almighty says this: because you have not listened to my words, I will summon all the peoples of the north and my servant Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, declares the Lord, and I will bring them against this land and its inhabitants, and against all the surrounding nations. I will completely destroy them and make them an object of horror and scorn and everlasting ruin. I will banish them from the sounds of joy and gladness, the voices of bride and bridegroom, the sound of millstones and the light of the lamp. The whole country will become a desolate wasteland, and those nations will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. That's what he's making reference to. So during this period of time, he knows that there's a 70-year period of time of Babylonian captivity. And so he looks at this and he's praying to God in reference to this. The 70 years of captivity, if you want to look at what timeline this would be, really at the beginning in 605 BC, knowing that the numbers go down as it gets later. 605 BC, the young nobility were first taken off to Babylon. This would have likely included Daniel's group. During that first wave of captivity, often called the first deportation, this happened after the Pharaoh lost the Battle of Carchemish, and that allowed the northern peoples to be able to come in, Nebuchadnezzar and all the Babylonians. Winning that really allowed them to sweep in. 597 BC was when the second group. The interesting thing about this captivity, they didn't all go at once. They came in waves, 3 waves, really. In 586, the third deportation is when the temple was destroyed. Jerusalem finally falls entirely at that point. So that conceivably is really the beginning of the 70 years. Even though it started at 605, because it's not until 538 that there's a decree that they can go back and rebuild, but later, closer to 520, 515, and if it were exactly 516, that would be the 70 years when they make their way back to actually start returning in large numbers. So there were some that started to come back during that period of time, but the larger waves come in a little bit later. Either way, if you go from 605 to about 538 or so, that's about 70 years. Or if you go from 586 to 516, that'd be 70 years. You get the idea. He was saying for 70 years. Whether he meant it as 70 years to the date, we're not really told that. He just said for 70 years, you guys are going to be in captivity, and all the peoples around you as well. So that's the reference that Daniel is praying about. All right, so keep that number, though, in your mind, because I think the answer, which comes in the prophecy of the 77s, is an answer to about these 70 years. All right, so I prayed to the Lord my God and confessed, Lord, the great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments. We have sinned and done wrong. We have been wicked and have rebelled. We have turned away from your commands and laws. We have not listened to your servants, the prophets, who spoke in your name to our kings, our princes, and our ancestors, and to all the people of the land. There is no passing blame here. Daniel is saying, we messed up. As Israel, as Judah, as your people, we messed up. This is all on us on this one. So it is very repentant in the way that it's worded. It is also on behalf of the entirety of the people. As Daniel prays to God, calling out to him, he says to them, we did this to ourselves. We were the ones that caused this to happen. But he goes on and he says, Lord, you are righteous. But this day we are covered with shame. The people of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem and all Israel, both near and far, and in all the countries where you have scattered us because of our unfaithfulness to you, we and our kings, our princes, and our ancestors are covered with shame, Lord, because we have sinned against you. The Lord our God is merciful and forgiving, even though we have rebelled against him. We have not obeyed the Lord our God or kept the laws he gave us through his servants and prophets. All Israel has transgressed your law and turned away, refusing to obey you. Where would he say that he's merciful and forgiving? What was the punishment of what they actually did? Death, right? But instead they get captivity, kind of a temporary holding, and then they're going to be allowed to return to his place. That's God's mercy. God's judgment allowed for him, based on what he had already set out as the rules, to annihilate them at this point. They could have easily all been put to death for what they did. But instead, he says, God, you're merciful, you're forgiving, and they're in this captivity. Therefore, the curses and sworn judgments written in the law of Moses, the servant of God, have been poured out on us because we have sinned against you. Not to the full measure, though. It could have been worse for them. But the fact that they are getting punished is certainly it had already been written down for them. They knew when they were being disobedient. They knew what the punishment was. You have fulfilled the word spoken against us and against our rulers by bringing us great disaster. Under the whole heaven, nothing has ever been done like what's been done to Jerusalem. And by the way, it's interesting when he says that, because the foreshadowing there is, you don't know you don't even know what's about to happen to Jerusalem later. Because at the time, Daniel's words are true. Nothing really, they'd never heard of or seen anything that had happened like the laying of waste. And I don't know that Daniel had seen it with his own eyes, but he hears about what's happened by this point in time in Jerusalem. We don't hear that he's gone back to see it himself, but the fact that it's fallen, the temple was destroyed, this is unfathomable to him. Just as written in the law of Moses, all this disaster has come on us, yet we have not sought the favor of the Lord our God by turning from our sins and giving attention to your truth. The Lord did not hesitate to bring the disaster on us, for the Lord our God is righteous in everything he does, yet we've not obeyed him. And it's again, very much, it's our fault. You've yet to hear one bit of but. It's all very much, it's our fault. It's our fault. We get it. It's our fault on this one. Now, Lord our God, who brought your people out of Egypt with a mighty hand, and who made for yourself a name that endures to this day, we have sinned, we have done wrong. Lord, in keeping with all your righteous acts, turn away your anger and your wrath from Jerusalem, your city, your holy hill. Our sins and the iniquities of our ancestors have made Jerusalem and your people an object of scorn to those around us. So in other words, he's saying the reason Jerusalem is in ruins, it's us. The reason that everyone can look it down on us with scorn, it's us. But God, that is still your city. That is still your people. And he pleads with him to turn away from this anger. He pleads to God's mercy and his righteousness as a way to relent. And so that he can turn back away from this anger. 70 years of captivity, they're nearing the end of it. And he's like, just let us, let this end. We've messed up. We need to get back, and we need to be doing what you need us to do, which is to turn back to you. That's what you've always wanted for us. And he pleads on that. All right, so now our God, hear the prayers and petitions of your servant for your sake, Lord. Now, again, this is not about, I just want out of here. Daniel doesn't have a hard existence. For anyone who's praying this, Daniel is arguably better off from a human standard. He's been a lot better off in Babylon. I mean, he's been in the palace. He's been leader. He's ranking up to as high as, at times third highest in the whole kingdom. It's not like he's suffered in that sense, but it's not where he's supposed to be. It's not where he can bring glory to God as well. And so he says, for your sake, Lord, look with favor on your desolate sanctuary. Give ear, our God, and hear. Open your eyes and see the desolation of the city that bears your name. We do not make requests to you because we are righteous, but because of your great mercy. Lord, listen. Lord, forgive. Lord, hear and act. For your sake, my God, do not delay, because your city and your people bear your name. And I really think if you look at what the heart of Daniel is here, what he's really crying out for is, God, it bothered him that God's name was being run through the mud because the city of God looked like what it looked like. It was in ruins. And that becomes a theme over the next several generations. We see this in books like Ezra and Nehemiah. Where the rebuilding is going on, it's always under this idea that we have to rebuild the name of God. Using what Daniel kind of launches in this prayer to become kind of a rallying call for Israel and Judah as they make this return back, that he says, I want this to be something that we can rebuild the name of God to the people around us so that they can see that you are as good as you are, but that they won't see you as defeated the way this city was defeated because of us. Not because of you, but, and so he's very careful to never put the blame on God, but he says he wants people to see God in a better light because of what, not because of the desolation that they brought about through their sin. All right, so this is the prayer that he kind of reaches out to. While I was speaking and praying, confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and making my request to the Lord my God for his holy hill. While I was still in prayer, Gabriel, the man I had seen in the earlier vision, came to me in a swift flight about the time of the evening sacrifice. He instructed me and said to me, Daniel, I have now come to give you insight and understanding. As soon as you began to pray, a word went out, which I have come to tell you, for you are highly esteemed. Therefore, consider the word and understand the vision. That's interesting because as soon as Daniel started praying, imagine the word going out was God saying to Gabriel, all right, you need to go tell him this. Here he is worried about 70 years of captivity. We need to be teaching him about something else that is still yet to come, that he can understand a little bit more about where this whole plan is going, and so that he can see a bigger picture to this. So go and tell him this. And he comes and he sends Gabriel in a swift flight down to him. And like most of the time, when they arrive, we see the message being brought in a very timely fashion and a very impactful way here. So Daniel's prayer was focused on the current state of Israel, where it was lying in ruins, that Jerusalem was a desolate waste. God gave him a better understanding into this greater plan, and he goes and expands it out into a larger timetable. But he uses the same number that he's been working with already on this. 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. So he's like, there is all this that's still going to happen, and it's going to happen in 77s. So what are these sevens? That's one of the big questions that comes up there. Oftentimes in other references in Scripture, sevens are referred to, as years, and so or a week of years is a 7, and so the best understanding is that there's going to be 77-year time periods still out ahead of us, which would give us essentially a length of 490 years. That this is still going to happen over the next 490 years, and whether this is very specific to 490 years or whether it's kind of a loose, about that long kind of reference, he's going to say what all is going to happen during that time. All right, so know and understand this. From the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. So in other words, 69 sevens altogether. Broken into 2 pieces, the first 7, the big chunk, the 62 sevens. And so at this one, the appointed one, the ruler, comes, there will be 70 sevens and 62 sevens. It will be rebuilt with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble. All right, so these 7 sevens, the first grouping. From the time it was taken to rebuild Jerusalem, from the time the word goes out. So on that one, 2 options of times that a decree was sent out. One was sent out during the first year of Cyrus's reign in 536 BC. He sends out an edict that they can return. That is one of the things that happened in that year. And in 437 BC, and that may not be the right year. I may have typed that one wrong. I think it is 437 though. It's on another slide, so I'm just making sure I hold that thought. It might be a typo. For some reason, a different number was in my head, but 437 might be correct. 437 BC, during the reign of Artaxerxes, which you read about in Ezra 7 through 10, there is another, yes, you can go rebuild, that happens during that time that references back to Cyrus, which is a study in and of itself to watch God's plan play itself out, how during the reign of Cyrus, under a time where the law couldn't be repealed, he says, you may go back, and then it is written down, sealed, and it has to happen. Later, when Artaxerxes looks back and finds that rule, it becomes more solidified that, okay, yes, during those times of trouble, you're going to go back and rebuild this. And then a longer period of 62 sevens, which is the rest of the time, where Jerusalem, you can say, is almost back to normal. And in one sense, it's back to its old self in a lot of ways, leads up to the coming of Christ. And this is a longer period that encompasses all of the intertestamental period. And so this is where we don't have a lot of biblical accounts during that long period of time until we get toward the tail end of it when we see the anointed one coming. All right, so here's kind of a little slide here that kind of shows it. It is 437. I don't know why in my mind I was thinking it was something else. All right, so from the decree to rebuild Jerusalem, which is the beginning of this prophecy, you really have 2 options. You can either take 536 BC or 437 BC. They're both valid starting points because they both are a decree to go back and rebuild. The end of the rebuilding then would be a little unknown on how it would fit into 7 sevens if you use the Cyrus decree. It's hard to fill that gap in because 49 years later is not the right year. So it would have to be more generic timelines and just periods of time rather than specific. But if you were to go and look at it the other way around, at the end of that 7 sevens, you'd come up with 408 BC for the end of the rebuilding. And then from that on down to the end of the first 69 sevens. So now we go all the way through 62 sevens. You get up to the point where you're at 26 AD. On the other one, you get up to 26 BC. There's a little issue there. But again, you get the idea here that we see this concept of how this is laid out. And either way, it gets us to 70 AD for the last of those, which is the destruction at the end of the 70th week, which we're going to get to here in just a second. Why do I show you that? Okay, well, mathematically, you could come up with a lot of different ways that gets to it. I find some of these very intriguing, that if you get to the exact year, that you're able to put it all the way up to the point where you can get to 26 AD, which is essentially toward the start of Jesus' ministry, near it, pretty close to it. There is at least a point where we get to where we see where the target range is. And I think these 77s, now the other way you can get around some of these numbers is by utilizing different ways of counting years. What country is this being written, or written in, and the original readers would have heard this, or the original recipients of this? This is into the Babylonian time, and it's into Medo-Persian time. Babylonian calendars use 360 days a year, not 365. And so if you would make those adjustments over a long period of time, it actually gets even closer to some of the dates. And so maybe it was in reference to that. Here's the issue. If we look at this and stare at these dates and try to figure it out to something Daniel wasn't told, the exact dates, we're going to get into the weeds. I show you this to show you, I think we've got a general good rough estimate of which time periods each of these things are going to happen in. From a time of a decree to the time of when the rebuilding takes place. And then from the time from the rebuilding is place all the way up to the coming of Christ. And then during that time period, we're going to see Christ cut off. And then there's going to be an even greater destruction of Jerusalem, which brings us up to 70 AD either way. And so this whole concern about the 70 years of captivity that Daniel's praying about when this word goes out to him, it's an answer to that prayer, is a reference then to the fact that he says, you're basically concerning yourself about the wrong 70 period, here. Like, there's something else that's going to go on here that's a much bigger deal than this one. This is a part of my plan, but there's still a lot more plan yet to come. So after the 62 sevens, the anointed one will be put to death and will have nothing. The people of the ruler who will come and will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. Now, understand, this is all very much specifically talking about Jerusalem. We would run into a real issue if all of a sudden we tried to jump ahead and apply this to end times, which is quite often what happens. The issue here is that it's not even the subject being talked about. The subject being talked about is God rebuild Jerusalem. And he's like, oh, it's going to get rebuilt. It's going to get destroyed again. And so that's essentially his answer to his prayer is, it'll get rebuilt. The word will go out. We will get Jerusalem rebuilt. That's not an issue. And then later I'm going to send my anointed one, and that city is going to defy me again. And this time it'll be laid to waste. So he will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. What, in reference to this, of the anointed one putting an end to sacrifice and offering, what does that look like? And again, this is class, so you can answer it out loud if you. What was the end of sacrifice?
Well, at the cross, when Christ dies on the cross, then the priest sacrifice stuff supposed to end, but the church is established, and so.
Because his sacrifice was once for all.
Yeah,
so,
once for all. Yeah.
So there's no more need for it at that point.
That's what I was trying to say.
No, I was following you. That's exactly right. That's the idea. So when you look at what was happening during that last period of time, when the anointed one comes, halfway through, he's cut off, has nothing, but puts an end to the sacrifices. That's a kind of a pretty good telling of the fact that Christ, the anointed one, capitalized for a reason in this, that he is going to come, he's going to send him, he's going to be put to death, and that it'll put an end to the sacrifices. So the end will, so he will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7, and in the middle of that 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. At the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. Okay. That's where the wording gets a little weird, because it sounds like Jesus sets up this abomination. Jesus himself is a little bit more clear in his words on this over in Matthew chapter 24. He's going to make reference to this, and this helps us understand this a little bit better. He says, so when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Now this is where this is kind of this understanding of, he wants this message to get out. When you see this, when you see these things that were this abomination that causes desolation, when you see the horrible things that will end up happening in the city leading up to AD 70, which they don't have the year given to them, but this is essentially what's happening here, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. Many people, many historians will say that the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 was one of the worst humanitarian issues that has ever taken place. And this is what he's saying. If you notice it's about to happen, you flee to the mountains and you don't stop. This is his warning to them. He says, when you see that the only sign is this abomination that causes desolation, that's the only real sign they got that it was about to happen. That was the last straw, essentially, before Jerusalem gets destroyed. So when he's talking about, Lord, protect your name, protect your city, bring it back, rebuild it, his answer to them, or answer to Daniel is, that's going to happen. That's not the issue here. Later, it's going to happen again. In 77's time later. And by that point, it doesn't matter as much, even though it's worse and all that, because I will have sent my anointed one who will make a covenant with them. And so again, we kind of see that there at the end of that in Daniel chapter 9. All right. Any comments or questions about that? Things get a little interesting through this period of time. The 77s was one, because there's all this mathematical numbering and all this stuff. When I was at OC, one of my papers I had to write for one of my, I guess it was my Daniel and Revelation class that I took. It was either that or for one of my math classes, because I did the mathematical approach to it. I think I just did the mathematical approach for my Daniel class, but I wrote a kind of a whole mathematical breakdown of all the different starting points, all the different calculations you can have, and ultimately there's a point where there's not like a perfect, is exactly what the date is when this decree happened. You get to exactly when this event happened, and you get to exactly that. I don't think he was giving that to Daniel to answer him, okay, here's the dates you need to know because you're going to be dead by then. He didn't need the exact dates. He said there's going to be 70, if you break it up into 70 periods of time. If you're concerned about 70 years of captivity, here's these 77s that you need to be thinking about, and the first 7 of them is the rebuilding. 62 of them is when you're living there again and everything's functioning as Jerusalem should. And it's that last 7, that last week where everything starts happening. Interestingly, we're going to see halfway through that, what's half of 7? Oh, math. Sorry. Threw that one out of left field, right? What's half of 7? 3.5. Time, times, and half a time. You're going to see that come up again later as we see all of this constant reference to 3.5 times, or time, times, and half a time. And that repeated idea of what happens in that 3.5 year window of time, which isn't really 3.5 years, it's 3.5 sevens on this one. Other times it's 3.5 years. He uses that symbology over and over again, not because he had to then, but because it opens up a capability of code, if you want to think of it that way, that they can then talk to each other during the time of the Roman Empire to encourage one another, which was the point of the book of Revelation. And so all of that symbology is then referenced back of time, times, and half a time. Remember how he's going to save his people? At time, times, he's going to save you too. You remember all that? And he keeps using those not literal things, but these figurative things that the Romans are like, I have no idea what this means. Half the world still reads it. I have no idea what this means. But if you read it in light of why it was written in Daniel and apply it again to why it was used and the method by which it was written in Revelation, it all starts to make more sense. And so we see these times and half a times, or 3.5, references thrown in. Again, we'll see this again in chapter 12, actually, when the book whole kind of comes full circle and wraps up there. So, any questions? Yeah.
It just seems interesting to me that he's trying to get, besides what he's telling people in the present era, or what he's in our era, that he's trying to get Daniel to put things in perspective. Here's a great man that's really got all the blessings temporal, but still trying to serve the Lord, but he's wondering about, what's going to happen. He's trying to tell him, well, hey, this is the nature of our people. This is the nature of, they're going to get out of this, but they're still, this is what Jewish people are like. This is in effect what the Christian world is like. Mm-hmm. We're going to be have to struggle to get it right.
Yeah. I was finding this.
It's kind of comforting for.
Oh, absolutely, it's comforting.
If I've been Daniel, Daniel's sitting here thinking about, well, what's going to happen? Are we going to get back? And we don't deserve to get back, but are we? And then and he's still humble about it, but still, I think it's kind of comforting.
Yeah, and I think that the comfort too comes from the fact that, and this is where I find it one of those really intriguing things that human nature falls into a lot of times. We're completely fine with Jeremiah's prophecy of 70 years of captivity being a loose 70. It doesn't have to be down to the very day. We're totally okay with that idea that it's about 70 or very, very close to 70. And then when he's praying about 77, all this, end this, the 70's coming to an end, rebuild your city, rebuild your city, rebuild your city. And he says, okay, let me teach you about another 70. Then all of a sudden we want to get this down to the exact date and come up with exact things. I think he was kind of playing off of that a little bit and giving him a pretty general timeline in which he can get, I'll tell you about another 70 and break them up in these chunks. It'll kind of explain it to you. It was less about getting it down to the exact date on a calendar, but instead, otherwise, everybody would have known what was going to happen in 70 AD. If you could have just added 490 years to this particular date, then you get to that exact date, and it's like, well, there we are. And so they would have known that. Mathematically, it doesn't get you to there, but symbolically it does. And that is the whole takeaway. And it sometimes can be frustration when we look at this, but I have never quite understood why we're okay with some of the other 400 years in captivity or, 70 years in captivity. Those can be a little bit loose, but 77s ought to be mathematically precise in order to be right. No, that wasn't what the point of that was. The point of that was really to teach them that there is still something big that is going to happen in Jerusalem, and it's going to change things. And Jerusalem will fall again even over that as well. So, all right. We'll end there.